Um, this is NASA's Viper rover. It's part of the Artemis program. It's going to go to the moon and look for evidence of water. 4 years ago, I was working on an earlier version of this model. And one thing I learned working on a flight forward mission is that the most important job of systems engineering is to say no to fun. Um, this is not out of malice. Operational considerations, environmental considerations, and swap constraints limit considerably what we can put on these systems. And what I was trying to put on these systems was adapted, sophisticated, asterisk, AI. So the thing I was specifically being told no about was doing automating exploration, and I used Bayesian optimization as a model of curiosity for these robots. I wanted the robots to make decisions for scientists when they couldn't talk to the scientists. And the way that you do this is you put some kind of joint distribution over your action space and your observation space, and you try to satisfy some objective function that trades off the exploration exploitation dilemma. That is to say, maximizes or tries to maximize getting reward and gaining information about the thing you're trying to interact with simultaneously. And then the tactic or the tool that I'd use would be Gaussian process regression. This isn't going to work in space, because the Gaussian process regression has memory constraints that grow unbounded in the square of the number of samples you collect, and the time to select the next action grows in the cube of the number of samples you've collected. Which means that if you have bounded resources, if you have bounded time, this is not going to fly. Now, there are alternatives. You can use sparse Gaussian processes, you can use graphical models, you can discretize the space, that sort of thing. There's all these different things you can do. But eventually, you're going to hit problems where this limitation will show up again, right? And we had 5 watts of computing power budget. 10 years ago, the state of the art in space computing lagged state of the art computing by 20 years. But after 10 years of development, it now lags by 30 years. If you want to put a GPU-based machine learning algorithm there, it's not going to work. And so I turned to neuromorphic computing. In 2016, I went to the NICE conference in Berkeley, and I sat next to this lovely gentleman named Penty, and I learned about vector symbolic architectures, although we're pushing for algebras as the terminology, so you forgive me if I add another term to the namespace. And specifically, between the jigs and the reels, I ended up in Chris Eliasmith's lab working with holographic reduced representations. Now, yesterday, Chris Kim did yeoman's work presenting the Fourier holographic reduced representations, which is basically the Fourier space version of this algebra. And I'm just going to try and briefly recap this here. But the notion is you have some data space, and then you have a projection into a high-dimensional vector space. And this is a stand-in for a neural network, right? Our data are usually projected onto hyperspheres and hypertori. And then you have this dimensionality-preserving algebra of binding, which is sort of an and-like construction, and unbinding, which will sort of unpick the and operation. Then you have bundling, which is like a sec construction or an or operation. You have similarity, which lets you do basically analogy-based reasoning. How similar is this thing to that thing? And then you have permutation, which is important along with binding for composing structured representations in this vector space. And all of this while remaining on your hypersphere or your hypertorus. And the key tool that we use is fractional binding or fractional power encoding, which is a way of projecting real valued data into this vector space. Specifically in this work, we use the hexagonal SSP, which is just a particular approach to fractional binding, but that's modeled on the representations that you find in grid cells. Right? Something interesting happens when we take the similarity between data encoded in this way, and that is that the similarity function, as you change your inputs, traces out a positive definite kernel. In our case, it's a sinc function, which is weird because it can go negative, and that's not usual, but it remains positive definite, and this means we can use it if we want to approximate kernel machines. Now, I want to put a pin in that for a second, because based on the discussions we've had today, I want to highlight 3 things about vector symbolic architectures and holographic reduced representations in general. One, this is a tool for co-design, not necessarily the only tool, but this is very much like, this is a very Lisp-like language in the sense that data and functions are expressed using the same tools. But also, the operations are all implemented using neural networks, right? There are microcircuits that we specify that do this math. which means that when we write a program, when we write a data structure, we are specifying a circuit to a first order approximation. Second, something that falls out of that is because the neural networks are doing these specific operations, our learning is actually happening in the activities of the neural populations, which means that we don't necessarily do synaptic learning, so you can potentially get faster adaptation. So when Dr. Huang presented yesterday about these collections of phasors representing grid cells that did fast adaptation, my mind lit up because the Fourier space representation of this, our high-dimensional vectors are high-dimensional vectors of phasors, and consequently phasor cells. Which is not to say that this precludes the notion of doing gradient-based learning. These algorithms, these algebras are differentiable, right? We have run back propagation all the way through SPAN, which is the neural circuit the brain model that Chris Eliasmith in his lab developed. But what I mean to say is that this is compatible with gradient-based learning, and through using knowledge, we can impose structure and thereby hopefully reduce the sample complexity of learning outcomes. And then finally, the third thing is that our binding operation is done using circular convolution. This is executed by in the Fourier domain, we do element-wise multiplication. In time domain, we do circular convolution. This is done by taking one vector and multiplying it by a circulant matrix constructed from the other. The important thing about that is that a circulant matrix is a special case of a Toeplitz matrix. And it's how we impose structure. And if you remember from Terry Sanowski's talk on the first day, he identified Toeplitz matrices as being important. And I think this is an interesting connection that we should all pursue. But I digress. Similarity induces positive definite kernels. We can use this to approximate Gaussian process regression. On the left, we have a GPR, and on the right, we have the same data projected into our high-dimensional vector space, and we approximate it with Bayesian linear regression. And this is something that gives us a benefit in the sense that this C to the -1 matrix in the Gaussian process regression, that's the thing that causes all the trouble. It's a pairwise comparison of every point in your data set, and you have to invert that. That's where the n squared memory, n cubed time comes from. We also have a covariance matrix, but it's fixed in the dimensionality of our vector representation, and that lasts for the lifetime of our operation, which means in terms of the number of samples, this is a constant time, constant memory output. This can fly. Something else that's interesting is that when we rewrite our mutual information objective function, and I apologize for the math, when we rewrite our mutual information objective function this term, the function that becomes convex, which means we can admit simple optimization to figure out the best next action to take. Previously, we had just thrown this into the SciPy minimize function, but that is not necessarily neural forward. So the contribution of this paper is implementing this in recurrent dynamics, and we implemented this in the Lava framework. We based this off the QP solver quite heavily. That's in the optimization package. Now, I do not want you to misconstrue and think that we think this is the first time somebody has tried to optimize things with recurrent dynamics. This goes back as far as at least Tank and Hopfield. But we did this thing, and it works. What we're seeing here is the average cumulative regret of our algorithm tested on 3 different standard testing functions. We used a Gaussian process regression with a Maturana kernel as sort of the baseline, and then we used our dynamic implementation of our objective function using these hexagonal SSPs as the feature space representation with 64, 32, and 16-bit precision floating point numbers, just to see how that affects things. For those who don't know, regret is the difference between how well you did and how well you could have done. And the average cumulative regret is just the sum of all your regret over your lifetime, just depending on how long you've been doing things. And if you're doing things right, your regret should decrease as you go on, which is both useful in terms of measuring machine learning systems and maybe guiding life itself. What we see in this graph is that the performance of all the algorithms basically is fairly similar. This is behaving in a way that is not inconsistent with the Gaussian process model implemented exactly and algebraically. I will point out with the 64-bit resolution numbers, our hex SSP performance seems to be doing the best. That's all I want to say about that. I don't really want to make strong claims. Just in this case, it works fairly well. And that, I think, speaks to the utility potentially of these grid cell-like representations that we find of the brain. So to sum up, these are useful tools for doing Bayesian optimization in the brain. We have provided a Lava implementation of this with a path towards full neural implementation. We're still mapping it to the chip. The poster that I presented a couple of days ago was part of this process of getting it onto the chip, into the fixed point integer math and all that business. But that's where it lives and will develop. And then in terms of future work, we're expanding this to more complex problems. So that statement in submission will be true on Friday. What we're optimizing here is sets of trajectories assigned to agents in the scene. In this case is the task of putting a belt and a belt drive system in simulation, and the other is exploring a lunar crater. And using the same algorithm, just optimizing in this high-dimensional vector space, we can still get improvements in this task, and we're comparable. Well, I'll save the claims for the publication once it gets past review. But we're doing things interesting, and we don't have to change the optimization algorithm itself, which is kind of fun. So I want to thank our Intel liaisons, Dr. Fritz Sommer and Paxton Frady, and of course this was generously supported by an Intel neuromorphic research community grant and other granting agencies in Canada. So thank you all for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.